Anuradha Sengupta, and I'm delighted to bring you a conversation with prolific writer and Jnanpith Award winner author Amitav Ghosh. It's always exciting and illuminating to read a new book by Amitav. Ghoshnama is no different. It's a retelling of a particular incident or episode from Bengali folk epics on the legend of Bon Bibi, a goddess of the forests revered in the Sundarban. While Ghoshnama reiterates his commitment to use literature and art to reveal the catastrophic disruptions caused by man-made climate change, it also innovates with form and presentation. Let's talk more with Amitav Ghosh, who's joining us now from New York. Amitav, it's good to see you.
Thank you, Anuradha. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure.
Before we dive into the various aspects of the book, you want to just tell viewers who may not have read it, in a nutshell, the story, and I'm using the word story in quotes, the story of the book.
Ghoshnama is an adaptation of a legend, of a very popular legend in the Sundarban. In the Sundarban, everyone who lives in the vast mangrove forest, they have a great reverence for this legend, and the legend is told and retold and enacted by traveling theater companies. And the story is really about a rich merchant called Dhona, and who goes into the forest to try and take everything out of the forest. And in the end, he is trapped by the tiger spirit, Dukhin Rai. And Dukhin Rai demands an exchange. He wants to eat a human. So Dhona offers him his nephew. And in the end, the nephew is rescued by Bon Bibi. But the story is really about, how shall I put it? It's really about finding a balance between the human urge towards profit and the needs of other beings, of the beings of the forest.
So it is a fable. You picked this particular episode of those epic poems which talk about the legend of Bon Bibi because of the fable, isn't it? Because of the story, what it leaves you with, in a sense. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. We have so many stories of so many kinds, which are also fables, like, all those stories that urge you to sort of fulfill your ambitions, which say, just do it, impossible is nothing, and so on and so forth. But this is a story about limits. It's a story about, humans observing certain limits in relation to the earth and in relation to the world, to the environment.
You mentioned that it's about a rich man who ventures into the forest and to a place where he's not really supposed to be, driven by greed. Do you have a conversation between the rich man and his brother, Dhona and Mona, for people who haven't read the book? Mona suggests that, look, we have enough, we could be content and have a good life. And Dhona, on the other hand, says, no, why should we have idle fortunes? Why shouldn't we venture out? We are hardwired with both of these instincts or impulses. And the impulse to venture out and even to be greedy or perhaps ambition, or like you alluded to, all those brand slogans, in this era of consumerism, isn't that also helpful? It does help you progress, it does help you develop, it does get you somewhere, both as an individual and a society.
I can see that you're making an argument for that. But look, if there's any one thing that the current state of history tells us, is that there is no such thing as progress. It's a fantasy. It's a fantasy that's been sold to us from the 18th century onwards. It's a fantasy created to promote capitalism. That's all it is. Where do you see progress? What we are seeing, we are standing on the brink of the greatest disaster that humanity has ever faced. We are literally facing, catastrophe on all sides. And how in this circumstance can we talk about progress? Look, people put up those dams in Uttarakhand talking about progress, a progress and development. Do you think for the people who were killed, that was progress or development? These are just fantasies created in order for people to make money, a few people to make money.
So you're saying that Dhona's argument, and which is the argument, therefore, by capitalists and the capitalist form of society, has resulted in the catastrophic environment in which we find ourselves today.
Yes, absolutely.
Should governments have done a more acute job, a better job of regulating this impulse and instinct to make, to consume, and to push and progress in the way in which you are defining it?
You know, you can't sort of pin it on any one government or any one structure of governance. It's really the sort of governance that has taken hold of the entire world. You know, especially in the last 30 or 40 years under the sort of pressures of neoliberalism. I mean, it's this kind of all-consuming thing, so that governments now exist in order to promote consumerism. You know, that's really what it is. What we see everywhere is complete state capture by by corporates, which are essentially pushing this kind of consumerist model of consume more and more and more. And that's really why I feel it's so important for us to have other stories, to understand that there are two paths to happiness. Always get more, or be happy with what you have. So it's the second model, I would say, that we really need to understand. We really need to embrace at this point in time.
Yeah. Talking after the release of Gun Island, your previous book, you said, what lies ahead is deeply bleak and we'll have to face severe disruptions. And now we realize that everything will not get better. In fact, things will get catastrophically worse. And, it's just so scary sometimes to think that what used to be one-off occurrences of freaks of nature, of freakish behavior of nature today is just absolutely normal. So we are talking now, you just mentioned the dam, the glacier burst and what happened in Uttarakhand. We are talking about the freak winter storm in Texas and what is happening there. We've seen the fires ravage Australia and California, and of course we know about the drought and the imminent, catastrophe on that front in India. We've had problems with water. We have problems with floods. We have problems with cyclones. Do you think that today, then, any concept or any chance of people denying what man has done to the climate and the consequences that man and the rest of all the other species on this planet will face or are facing, do you think people have now at least begun to say, yes, this is true? Because you know better than anyone else about, denying climate change and man's role in it.
That's a very good question, Anuradha. Look, as you point out, when we last spoke for Gun Island, that was 2019. And, meet face to face. Let's look at the biggest disruption that we've ever faced.
Yes.
This pandemic,
Yes.
I mean, again, pandemics were thought to be impossible. We thought medicine had conquered everything.
Yes.
We had conquered nature. And look at us. One tiny pathogen has absolutely frozen the world in its tracks. You gave these other examples. I think the United States is actually a very good example of, so-called progress gone completely awry. Throughout this entire Mississippi Basin, especially over the last century, it's been completely re-engineered. The directions of rivers have been changed, hundreds of dams have been created. And now what we see is really that the landscape itself is revolting. Climate change created a circumstance where the landscape is coming undone. But they are now in a situation where they can't step back. They have to do more and more engineering. So they have to, they have to create a continual circumstance of, re-engineering the landscape, even as it's coming down undone in front of our eyes. Look, in India, we still haven't reached that point, of re-engineering landscapes, but now the government is talking about it, And we can completely predict the direction that it will take. It will end in utter disaster. So, it's several things coming together at the same time, and these things are not separate. We have these heavily sort of re-engineered landscapes which are completely interfered with by humans, and you have climate change. Already in India, we are beginning to see these catastrophic impacts. Look at Chennai, for example.
Yes.
People all over the floodplain, they're building in the river channels, they're building close to the sea. And, it's you can't win against water, In a moment of sea level rise, people are building in this way. It's obviously going to end in catastrophe.
Are people accepting today, at least, of everything that you are outlining or have spotlighted over the years?
I think it's, we've reached a point where it's no longer possible to do the old kind of denialism, Where it's no longer possible to say, no, nothing is happening, or, because everybody can see.
Yes.
It's all around us. We can see these disasters. In some countries, actually, extreme weather events have increased phenomenally by many hundredfold. So you can no longer shut your eyes to it. But I would say that in India, people do, especially urban Indians, are very much in denial. They try to just try to pretend that this is not happening, and yet it is happening.
Do you think that pause that the global lockdown imposed on humanity, do you think that will result in a new way to look at these things, in the way we consume, in the way we travel, and everything that sort of defined our lives up to that point of the lockdown?
There are two possibilities. One is the former that you mentioned, that after this pandemic, people will really take the planetary crisis on board. Let me say here that the pandemic and climate change are not directly connected as such. They're not causally related, but they're both aspects of the same phenomenon,
Yes.
which is this increasing acceleration that we have. I mean, after all, it's the eating up of the forests that has created these zoonotic diseases. So there is a sort of a connection between them, but. Again, as I said, there are two possibilities. One is that, humanity will wake up and say to itself, well, look, I mean, we are in trouble here. The other is that people will go back to exactly what they were doing, and unfortunately, the human record of these diseases shows that it's often the second. The most recent great pandemic was the 1918 influenza pandemic. And what did that lead to? That led to the roaring 20s, as they call it,
Yes.
this sort of incredible outburst of consumerism and, So, the portents are not necessarily good.
You're talking about the corporates, whether it is in India, whether it is in the USA and the capitalist economy. What do you make of Bill Gates's book, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster? I mean, when someone like that finally, picks up the cause, for lack of a better way of putting it, do you think that it will get many, many more people to understand what we are on the brink of?
Well, certainly it may serve the function of alerting some people to the disaster that lies ahead, because certainly all those talking heads, especially I would say in India, who are just constantly, who worship Bill Gates, will recognize perhaps that there is a problem.
There's something there. There's something there to get up and do something about.
Yeah, I mean, because they certainly wouldn't pay attention to, say, a novelist like me. So they'll pay attention to Bill Gates, perhaps. But look, what Bill Gates is proposing is very, very dangerous. His idea is actually geoengineering. He's the world's biggest investor in geoengineering. So what they now want to do, having failed at everything else, they now want to engineer the atmosphere. And it's especially us in India who have to be very, very wary of this. This is something we should resist at all costs. Because what will this geoengineering do? The most likely effect is that it will have a catastrophic effect on the monsoon. Already the monsoon is being impacted by climate change in many very disastrous ways, so that rainfall is becoming increasingly erratic. That's one of the reasons why Indian farmers are facing this catastrophe that they're dealing with right now. If we see a sort of widespread failure of the monsoon because of geoengineering, what can you say? I mean, that'll be progress for you, you know. But this is what they're planning. We should not doubt it. It's perfectly clear that the entire Western elite is now pushing geoengineering in a big way. Yale University, Harvard University, Bill Gates, they're all behind it. And they're going to get away with it. They're going to do it because actually for them, it can be done quite cheaply.
And you're saying that we will pay the price.
Of course, we will pay the price. Anyone who's dependent on the monsoons across Asia, we will pay the price.
Yes.
They don't care about that.
Amitav, the last year and that never before experience, what was it like for you? One would imagine that as an author, you tend to have, for large parts of your day and months and year, slightly solitary existence, and you tend to work on your own, except for when you're traveling and research, or maybe for book promotions. You're working alone. Was it easier, therefore, for you and by extension writers to cope with the kind of isolation that COVID-19 brought to our lives?
Writers draw energy from the world around them, from their observations of the world. And being deprived of that has been very, very difficult for many writers. For me, on the other hand, I must say that, just as the lockdown was beginning in early March, I was finishing Jnanpith.
Yeah.
So I finished Jnanpith, and it turned... I was extraordinarily lucky also because Salman Toor, the
who's
artist...
done all the illustrations for the book.
Who's done the artwork for the book, yes. So Salman, he wouldn't have been able to do this project if it had not been for the pandemic, because he had a big exhibition coming up that was postponed, and in that short window, he was able to do this amazing work. So in that way, it was very fortunate, and fortunate for me also in that I had another project, it's a nonfiction project. It'll be out actually in India in October. Again, it's about the planetary crisis. So I was intensely focused on that. I mean, there was a point at which I was reading like 2 books a day, So it was a period of very intense, very hard work, but also a period of terrible bereavement,
I was actually going to, ask you how it was to not be able to visit at that time, because you did tweet about losing your mother, isn't it?
Yes, my mother died in August, and it was shattering. I mean, I couldn't be there, I couldn't go, and the worst part of it is that my sister had to deal with it all, and I couldn't be there to help. The sort of utter helplessness, that I felt, it was just shattering. But it wasn't just me. There are many of us who went through the experience.
These are, difficult things to talk about, but I think sometimes it just helps because 2020 is a year where many people faced unexpected loss, and it just, it's sort of helpful to hear and talk. Amitav, you was writing Jnanpith and the form that the book took, which is the verse form and these 24-syllable long couplets, 2-line couplets of 24 syllables. That's a rigid framework. Was that a challenge? And because of the fact that you were inspired by, the style of Bengali narrative, poetry and narratives, did your writing also have to sound good when you read it out? Like, was that a double challenge?
Well, you'll remember that Gun Island, it also dealt very much with a legend, the legend of Monoshadi and Chand Shadagar.
Yes.
So, that legend comes from the Bengali Mangal Kavyas. The Mangal Kavyas are also mainly written in this verse form, which is called Poyar.
Yes.
It is, again, these couplets of, actually, strictly speaking, there should be 14 syllables, but I did 12 syllables. I did 12-syllable
But
lines.
is that because you were writing in English?
Yes, in effect. I wanted a slightly tighter form, if you like. But actually, it's a wonderful form. It's perfectly suited to narrative. All the Mangal Kavyas, all early Bengali storytelling, all pre-modern Bengali storytelling used this form. The Bonbibi legend is told in this form. So once you get accustomed to it, it's a very beautiful, supple form, and as you'll have seen in Ghoshnama, it actually carries the story forward.
Yes.
There's certainly its own kind of impetus to the story.
In fact, I was going to ask you that the referencing of the form and the form actually sort of like you said, taking the story forward. Was that a playful riff, or was it more meaningful than that? The fact that Dukhi, the character of Dukhi, has to be able to use Dvipodi Poyar, if I'm saying it right, to be able to be heard by his benefactress, by the patron of the forest, Bonbibi.
For me, really, the Poyar meter itself became something that was magical. It creates the magic of the book. It becomes a protagonist within the book itself. So that was certainly a very interesting aspect of the book for me. Because look, I mean, what is it when you write within a strict metrical form? It means you have to measure your words.
Yes.
It means that you have to watch your limits. It means that you have to be very aware of the limitations of language,
Yes.
of the strict sort of regulatory structure of language, if you like. So in a way, that mirrors the story of the book, And I do feel that, there's a reason why in the Indian tradition, stories have always been told in verse. I mean, the Mahabharata is in verse. I mean, the Ramayana is in verse. And, so many young writers now have been doing adaptations of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and so on. But none of them do it in verse. They always do it in prose. And I would really love to see them, using those metrical forms.
We've talked often and previously also about your love for language and, the origin of language and words and how it sort of mutates and transforms as it moves, with people moving. Give me, have you read it out aloud?
Oh, yes.
And did you find it more enjoyable reading this out aloud than prose, whether it is fiction or non-fiction that you've written? Was there something different in the way it felt when you read it aloud?
Oh, yes, absolutely. It's fun to read aloud.
Yes.
The rhythm and the rhyme really helps. See, that's another aspect of, pre-modern Indian literature. Books, stories were not meant to be read by individuals. They were neither written by individuals nor intended to be read by individuals. When I say not written by individuals, I mean that individual writers were really working within a tradition of other writers. They were referencing other writers and so on. Similarly, once the work had been produced, it was meant to be read aloud. It was meant to be sung. It was meant to be chanted. So, for example, in the Mangal Kavyas, for example, many of the verses will actually have a rag attached because
Yes.
you're meant to sing them out. I think this is a very important aspect of literature. It's an aspect that we've lost. Since the 18th century, it was only in the 18th century that people started reading silently. Within their own heads, which is what you and I have done,
Yes.
not knowing that it was a historically restricted practice, if you like. Today, very few people ever read aloud. But, for reading to become a collective activity, that is so necessary. It's so necessary to reclaim, that aspect of the collective experience of literature, the collective experience of reading.
Yeah.
So this was one of the ideas that I had in mind, when I was writing this book. I wanted to break with previous kinds of literary practices, where the individual writer is writing for the individual reader. I want it to be read out for a collective audience. I want it to be sung.
I guess you will be most delighted when you see people, whether it's kids or adults, actually perform Ghoshnama. Thank you so much for experimenting with form, for telling us these stories, and for joining us on this conversation.
Thank you so much, Anuradha. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you. Thank you.
And thank you very much for watching. Look out for conversations like this and stay tuned to CNBC TV 18.